Hello, this is Matthew Dubuque, and this is my presentation for my first project milestone for the Educational Technology class at Georgia Tech. To begin, I'd like to do an overview of this presentation. We'll start by refreshing on the project I chose. We'll talk about some of the topics I've selected for the podcast. I'll provide some links to the introduction and the first history podcast I've delivered. I'll provide an overview of the tools I've selected and used. We'll go over a little bit of lessons learned. And then I'll talk a little bit about the second topic that I've selected. And then I'll review the schedule and progress I've made. As a quick refresh, I'm pursuing the content track in this class. I plan to contribute educational content to the community in the form of a podcast. The title of this podcast is History, Filling in the Gaps. This podcast is aimed at addressing historical events and people that are not normally covered thoroughly in a typical education. Let's talk a little bit about the topics I've selected. To start off with, I did an initial introduction podcast, which was to serve as an experimental episode and provide a crash course in delivering a podcast, including the audio editing process. It was not nearly as trivial as I expected. There's actually quite a bit to learn here. A lot of research, a lot of videos on tutorials online that I went through, and I still didn't quite get it right, so I'm still working on that. It also provides listeners with an expectation of what the podcast is planned to provide in the future. For our first topic, I decided on General Vo Nguyen Giap. I definitely butchered his name. It's very hard to say. We call him General Giap in the podcast. But to give you a little bit of an idea of who we're talking about, he's described by some as the most successful general of the 20th century. He's also described as the Vietnamese Napoleon. To give you an idea of some of his accomplishments, he defeated the French and American militaries, along with Japan, Cambodia, and China in his lifetime. Interestingly, he never had any formal military training. He was actually a teacher. He was completely self-taught through history lessons and personal experience. And all these credentials, and I just barely heard about him recently, so I figured he would be a good topic for this podcast. So let's go a little bit into some of the tools I used to create the podcast. As far as audio engineering goes, I chose a free tool online called Audacity. As described on their website, Audacity is an easy-to-use multi-track audio editor and recorder for Windows, Mac, Linux, and other operating systems. It was developed by a group of volunteers as open source. I like all the sound of that, and it was well recommended online. So I downloaded it and began the process of learning how to use it. It did a good job for me. I would not say necessarily that it's super easy to use, but it was easy enough with the aid of a couple tutorials to get at least a mediocre audio sounding podcast out. Some of the other tools I used include a hosting service called Podbeans. So it offers free podcast hosting services with many nice features. As stated on their website, Podbean offers a user-friendly interface that integrates publishing, management, syndication, and analysis tools into an easy-to-use podcasting package. And I would definitely agree. It was extremely easy to publish the podcast. That part was easier than I necessarily expected. They have lots of tools to customize the page. I went online, was able to build a quick little free logo. And linked it to the website, and here you can see the published episode link. So that link there will take you to the podcast's webpage, which includes all of the published episodes currently out there. So let's go over some lessons learned. As kind of mentioned earlier, audio editing is not trivial. The feedback from the introduction podcast found issues with the volume. That was not apparent to me on my personal computer, but other listeners noted that the intro music was too loud and my voice sounded muffled. I thought I got that right. I guess I'll have to work on that a little bit more. There's lots of good resources online to help. As we're finding more and more these days, Google something and you'll find a good tutorial video, a podcast, an article, something that will help you. So that was really beneficial. Researching a topic takes a considerable amount of time. So I was planning on doing 3 podcasts, and I was hoping to get a certain amount of time, like 15 minutes. And the amount of research and the amount of time it takes to develop a podcast, I'm finding that I think I can at least stick to the amount of subjects, but I may not get quite the time. And as part of developing and delivering a podcast, I've realized that it's difficult to juggle having a script to keep you on track while not also sounding like a robot. So that's been an interesting thing that I've had to kind of work with. All right, so future topics, where I plan to go from here. So I have a couple ideas what topics to attempt next. I haven't narrowed it down to one, but right now I've kind of narrowed it down to these three. The Japanese super ships of World War II would be interesting to look at. Stuxnet would be interesting. I think a lot of people don't necessarily have quite the background in that as they probably should. Harriet Tubman, although she's covered quite a lot in typical education, I at least wanted to look into her to see if there's a couple of, whoa, I didn't know that type of things that might be interesting to stick in a podcast and let other people learn about. Okay, so getting to the end here, let's go over progress report. So on the left is the schedule that I proposed, and as you can see, all the items to the first milestone are in green, which means I've completed them. So that shows I'm currently on track with the proposed schedule. I will note that there's a potential issue with the amount of time needed to thoroughly research these topics and build a script. So my plan right now is to still deliver the podcast as proposed, but they may be shorter than I initially planned, but I still plan on having quite a bit of meat in each one. So thanks, this concludes my initial milestone presentation. If there's any questions, feel free to email me at mdubuque3@georgiatech.edu. Apologize for the kids and the dogs in the background. It's hard to get peace and quiet around here some days. All right, so thank you.